Hello and welcome to Sacred Spaces. My name is Sam Backman. I'm the Director of Sacred Music here at Holy Cross, and it is my delight this week to present this installation of Sacred Spaces of Northeast. Previously on this show, we've seen many tours of beautiful churches in the area, not the least of which are Holy Cross, St. Hedwig, and St. Clement. In various facets of that, Father Howe has very eloquently interwoven many facets of art, architecture, local history, and ecclesiastical history in these talks. And I wish to contribute to that in a somewhat different and specialized way this evening. So I'll really be giving this in a couple of different parts. The first part of this talk will be kind of a philosophical overview of why we have sacred music in churches, why specifically we have this strange instrument, this large instrument called the organ in churches. And then, after all of that, I'll give you kind of a brief demo of the various and sundry things that the organ can do and that it's used for. So, when we've spoken of many facets of the space, whether they're the walls, the pillars, or what have you, we've spoken of them, a lot of their aesthetic beauty or something noteworthy in their artistic qualities. That is maybe some aspect of an image in a stained glass window that speaks to a certain mystery of the faith. Now, if we look at any of these elements, yes, they have aesthetic beauty, they have symbolic richness, but in addition to all of that, they possess integrity of force. That is to say, they're functional. Now, we look at a window, it lets in natural light. We look at a wall, it keeps the outside and inside separated and it helps hold up the ceiling. And we look at pillars, of which we have many in this church, and they provide some sort of a structural support to the ceiling. And again, these things are purely functional. I'm going to tilt the camera out toward the church a bit. This ceiling, this beautiful coffered ceiling, would not stand were it not for the help of these walls and pillars. So, if we look specifically at the pillars, we realize that they can't only be decorative, they have to be sound, they have to be robust, and they have to be capable of supporting the weight load given them. So, there are a few things that a pillar must do to be beautiful. First off, yes, it's nice on the eyes, but more importantly, it needs to be clear it's serving its function. For example, if it's either too wide or too narrow, it might seem as though the pillar is either weak, inadequately up to the task, or fulfilling its task in a kind of inefficient or not very elegant way. So, to dial back several centuries in the church's history to the great St. Thomas Aquinas, a great theologian and philosopher of the 13th century, he said there are really three components you must have to beauty. That is integrity, harmony of proportion, and clarity. So, going back to the pillar, integrity, it has to be sound as a pillar, right? It needs to be capable of supporting the weight that it's given. Harmony of proportion. The pillar should not be so wide that it obstructs the side aisle, nor should it be so petite that we question, are we really in a safe building? Because that really does not put anyone at ease if they're in a large stone structure, especially on a day such as the current one where it's very hot, and I suspect a storm is coming in. But the third element is really the hallmark of what I want to focus on in this talk. That's clarity. We know that's a pillar. Its purpose as a pillar is clear, and we don't question that. So, I want to apply all of this to the church as a whole, this whole conception of beauty. But one thing I really want to make clear is that when we speak of the word beauty, at least kind of in religious matters, specifically Catholic matters, we're not merely talking about pretty things. I mean, yes, that pillar with its ornate Corinthian top is pretty. There's no question of that. But beauty is not merely pretty. It's an outward manifestation of an inward and underlying goodness. You know, they often say beauty is more than skin deep. You might find your spouse physically attractive, but that's hardly sufficient for you to find them beautiful. Cultures have heard various and sundry words like cute or hot or whatever to describe somebody they find physically attractive, but beauty tends to mean there's more of a deep connection to an underlying goodness. And I think the way that we speak of pillars or any other man-made good is the same way. Part of the reason that we have beautiful things in churches, and this has been a topic of debate for many centuries, is that our God is a God who, while invisible in essence, while intangible and we can't see the full triune Godhead, all three persons of the Trinity, physically present, we believe that God does want to make himself visibly manifest to us, and that's exactly why Christ took on human flesh. That's one of the reasons he deigned to leave eternal glory to lay aside perfect beatitude and happiness and come suffer as a human, is to be visible, to be concrete and tangible to humanity, to be available to us. And that's exactly why we don't gawk, or we don't scorn having beautiful things in church, and we don't scorn at having statues. Now, there have been many debates in the history of the church. Certainly we can think of Puritans or the likes of Henry Cromwell in Reformation England, who condemned images or beautiful things in the sanctuary as being idols, things that can distract us from God. That wasn't new at that point in history, though. That had been an ongoing debate since about the 8th century, when iconoclasm was defeated or was condemned as a heresy. And the reason for that being that we can't condemn images as being corrupt insofar as they're icons to God. They're ways of helping make an invisible God visible, like he did himself in his plan of making Christ incarnate in the flesh. So, this brings us full circle here to a question that I've posed to myself, and I suspect many others have. Why would, in the early 20th century, a group of working-class citizens in the Northeast, living paycheck to paycheck, invest a lot of resources to build something like this? I mean, certainly, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, investing in something like this is no doubt an undertaking. But I would argue that they understood the greatness of God. And that's precisely one of the things that makes this building beautiful, is that its beauty, its grandeur, portrays a grandeur and beauty that's far beyond this building, that of God Almighty himself. So, again, remembering that beauty is not just a definition, it's not just eye candy, it's a definition, or it's an outward portrayal of a deeper underlying goodness. So, and again, as grand and beautiful as we may see this building, it's but a slight fraction of God's grandeur. We think of St. Paul in one of his epistles reminding us that while on earth, we at best can see God through a dim mirror. We can only see him at a distance. We can only see a faint echo of his full glorified self. And part of that, frankly, is because of our own human capacity being so limited. In the Old Testament, it was believed that if you were to see God, you would surely die. And even so, today, we might not be able to handle the full splendor of God's glory if we were to see him face to face, unveiled. While we yearn for it, I can at least speak for myself, and I think I speak for most of us, the faithful on earth, that we simply aren't ready for it yet. The great St. Philip Neri said, "Paradise is not a place for sluggards." And he makes a quite valid point. Most of us have a lot of internal reordering to do before we can possibly pretend to be ready for heaven. And the great 20th century author, a medieval scholar and convert to Anglicanism, was C.S. Lewis, and he wrote about this reality in an allegorical novel called The Great Divorce. Here he speaks of a protagonist who has died, who has either left the rungs of, I don't recall if it's purgatory. At any rate, he gets to heaven, but it's not quite the picturesque storybook rendering of heaven that you expect, with angels and clouds and harps and general sedate relaxation and bliss. No, he was actually physically uncomfortable there, saying that the ground hurt his feet to walk upon. He couldn't quite make out images because they were too bright. And the point of all of this was, heaven is an acquired taste, and he, in his fallen nature, had to acclimate to heaven. And my friends, that's exactly what a church building aspires to do. It aspires to prepare us bit by bit for heaven. And that's part of the mission of the church on earth in its entirety. The church's liturgy, the church's mass, is intended to be a foretaste of heaven. And I think at this point of a medieval hymn in Latin known as O Sacrum Convivium, whose text goes as follows. O sacred feast, referring to the Eucharist, O sacred feast in which Christ is received, the memory of his passion is renewed, the mind filled with grace, and a pledge of future glory is given to us. So there we hear this kind of, this description of the Eucharist is tying together the past, the present, and the future, right? Christ's past sacrifice on the cross, our present sojourn on earth, and the glory that is to be beheld by the faithful in the future in heaven. Now, let's consider that the church is supposed to be a foretaste of heaven, and return to the three facets of beauty posited by St. Thomas Aquinas. We start firstly with integrity in a church building. It goes without saying that, again, structural integrity is a must. That's not the only sense in which the word integrity is meant, but it's certainly part of it. Its goodness, the goodness of any building is at least in part contained in its solidity of construction. Another thing is its beauty of proportion. If we look at this church, it's longer than it is wide, and there's a reason for that. You might say, yeah, it's so that multiple people can look toward the front of the church. And in part that pragmatic theory is true, but there's another important reason that rectangular churches are long, and I'm going to point you down the nave here. If we look down the nave, that is the center of the church, we see a long progression as we walk toward the east end of the building, toward the altar, toward the sanctuary. And it's located on the east end as a symbol of new life, pointed toward the new and heavenly Jerusalem. There's symbolic reason that this is literally oriented toward the east, the word orient coming from the Latin at east. And the idea here is that a church is designed to embody a pilgrimage. The altar representing heaven. Back here, or under where I'm standing, in the vestibule, there's something known as the tympanum, right? That's it's a sculpture that flanks the doors through which you walk. And in that you see the Last Judgment often portrayed. The reason for that being is that on a faithful's journey to heaven, they go through judgment and then enter into heaven. So the very design of a church building, in its proportions, is intended to embody the greatness of heaven. So what have we talked about with these three facets of Aquinas thus far? We've talked about integrity of the building, we've talked about proportions and how they relate to the kind of pilgrimage design of a church. I want to get now to a very important hallmark, which is clarity. It should be patently obvious to the viewer that this building is a church. And in an era where it's often popular to design a church in such a way that you wouldn't guess it, that's somewhat contrary to our tradition. The church is to be an icon, again, a glimpse of heaven on earth. It should be apparent to the believer that it's a church. I think back to a movement in 19th century England, in the Industrial Revolution, smog-ridden London. We had people working long hours with very minimal labor laws, very grim conditions, very grueling conditions, living a very hard life in industrial 19th century England. And one of the ideas by a proponent of the so-called Oxford movement was that the church, with its steeple, should be a beacon of heaven on earth to those living in such conditions. And no matter what our occupation, what our life situation is on earth, the church should be a reminder for us that we are designed for another kingdom than our own. Perhaps it's summoning us to virtue at times. Perhaps it's challenging us to overcome a specific vice. Perhaps it's comforting us in a specific trial. But whatever the case, a church should be clear about what it is, and it should be helping us to achieve this goal. Now, having spoken at length now about the role of beauty in a church, I want to transition to a very common piece of machinery that is found in churches, something whose job is to lend beauty, albeit not primarily in a sonic way. That is the pipe organ. Now, the pipe organ's identity with a church is long-standing, and to go deeply into the history of that would take a very long time right now. Organs existed long before the church, and in fact they existed in ancient Greece. A machine called the hydraulis, which was water-powered, functioned in such a way. But through the development, or through the 2 millennia now of the Roman Catholic Church, the pipe organ has become the standard instrument of choice. And while it had been defined in certain ways throughout, one of the strongest definitions came most recently in the Second Vatican Council, a council that in many ways was thought to, if anything, dismiss the organ, but quite to the contrary, it affirmed it as a preeminent part of the Catholic tradition in saying these following words: "In the Roman Church, the pipe organ is to be held in high esteem, for it is the traditional musical instrument which adds a wonderful splendor to the church's ceremonies and powerfully lifts up man's mind to God and to higher things." So once again, in the Roman Church, the pipe organ is held to be in high esteem, for it is the traditional musical instrument which adds wonderful splendor to the church's ceremonies and powerfully lifts man's mind to God and to higher things. So there are really two facets of that I like to draw our attention to here. And the first, as I said, is the traditional association of the organ as being the ecclesiastical instrument, the church instrument really, a churchy instrument. And that ties into the idea of clarity. If we're going back to Aquinas's facets of beauty, clarity. It's a clear part of Catholic tradition. Though organs certainly were found in many other environments besides churches over the centuries, it is first and foremost an ecclesiastical instrument. So that's a clear part of its association with tradition. Another thing that I want to draw our mind to in that quote from the Second Vatican Council, though, comes in its ability to lift our minds to God, to lift our eyes to things above. We remember our definition of beauty as an embodiment of an underlying goodness. And if the organ if it's tasked to portray an underlying goodness, it should be nothing other than the splendor of God. And of course, like this beautiful building or any other beautiful house of worship, no matter how grand, no matter how splendid, no matter how skillfully designed, can't even be a fraction of the full glory of God. Nevertheless, the task persists. And I want to tell a story from my personal life, and I think one of the reasons that I ended up perhaps spending a lot of time pursuing this instrument came from my childhood when we were attending Holy Rosary Cathedral in Duluth, Minnesota. I walked in there for the first time and saw a case of pipes in the back, and remembering they looked a lot like very tall crayons, like crayons you'd see in a crayon box, and that was what I kind of remember thinking. Then when I remember hearing it sound, I was awestruck at its grandeur, at its size, at the sound it made. It was just this larger-than-life idea. And I think I remember thinking at that point, being in a church, hearing about God, and hearing and seeing that large instrument. Wow. God is very, very large, very all-encompassing, very other. And that's exactly part of the reason that I think this instrument took that hold. If I could say so from the eyes of myself as a child, its power and its grandeur certainly are part of it. What I'd also like to note, though, and this is often more overlooked, is its versatility. This instrument can certainly be loud. It can also be whispering soft. It can be barely audible. And that's crucial, especially for accompanying the Mass, right? Because there are moments where it needs to be very subtle. There are moments where it needs to be grand, but there are moments where it needs to be subtle. And this versatility, in part, or another facet of this versatility, I should say, is that it can imitate many different instruments. In a sense, it's an orchestra played by one person. It's sort of an efficiency orchestra, if you will, and that it has functioned that way over time. There, for example, many pieces of music that I'll play that were originally written for full orchestra, but absent the budget to call in a full orchestra week after week, we can still hear those works here at the fingertips of an organist, and certainly when accompanying a choir on such a piece of music as Handel's Messiah, originally to be accompanied by an orchestra, an organist can make an imitation of that, and that's useful. Now, another facet of the organ's suitability for the liturgy is that it imitates what's really the hallmark instrument. The true prime instrument, I would argue, even though this is the physical instrument that's given pride of place, I would argue that the prime instrument sits right in the larynx. It's the human voice, and that's what this imitates. It's a wind instrument, and as such, it's very useful for helping people to sing. For example, to sing hymns. We have a few roles. If we look at this instrument, the first role, as I see it, is to help a congregation sing. Really, to enable people to sing without having to practice beforehand, without having any verbal direction on how to do it. An organist, by breathing in time with a congregation, can help spur them forward. The second function is accompanying choral singing. That is, singing by a subset of people, a choir that's rehearsed specifically. And again, as I mentioned, it often functions as a kind of a budget orchestra, if you will. A machine that can be played by one person, but produce the many voices of an orchestra. And last but not least, it functions as a solo instrument, and a vast wealth of repertoire has been written for it over the course of several hundred years. In many periods in the church's history, during various afflictions, I could think, for example, of the persecution of the church in England. The organ, though a laudable part of the Roman liturgy, often was absent, either due to monetary constraints or due to needing to worship in clandestine circumstances. We're in a unique position in history right now where the organ is just fine. The organ is just fine to have. But due to the dangers of singing associated with COVID-19, the human voice is suppressed. And that's a really heartbreaking thing for anyone who takes an interest in church music, I think, that the human voice, which is designed as a crucial part of our humanity to praise and to give back to God, can't be used right now. That's a true sadness. But luckily, I do have it on good authority that organs are not in danger of transmitting disease. So thank goodness we can still have some form of music absent singing. So now, having spoken a bit of the church's adaptation of the organ, kind of its history in the church and some of the reasons that it became the instrument that it has for the church, I want to now turn to the machine themselves. For several hundred years prior to the advent of, say, the internal combustion engine or the computer, pipe organs were possibly the most complex machines. And even if that may not be the case anymore, I certainly think they are the most complex musical instrument. And like any other instrument, they've changed as technology has developed. We can even think, for example, of a guitar, an instrument of Spanish origin that was acoustic for many years, but in the late 30s, or in the mid-30s, Les Paul and other people of that ilk thought to electrify them, and now we have the electric guitar, And yeah, somebody playing the guitar in 1890 would have never guessed that about 90 to 100 years later, AC/DC would be playing such solos as Thunderstruck or anything of that nature. But such is the interaction between technology and musical instruments. It's really a fascinating barometer of culture and technology and industry. And the pipe organ is no exception. Some of the major adaptations that have come here have come through electricity and through computers. Now, electricity is a big one. In a little bit, I'll take you back to the blower room. That is, to the room where the engine that supplies the organ with wind is housed. Prior to that, somebody had to walk up and down on billows while an organist played to supply wind. A very thankless task, I believe, and certainly not an easy one. So, let me actually take you on a brief tour of the instrument right here. And I'm going to pull this camera gingerly off the tripod and show you down here that you really see 4 keyboards. There are 3 keyboards played by the hands here, and mind you, some organs can have as many, well, the Wanamaker store in Philadelphia has 7. That's rather atypical and certainly a bit onerous for the organist. Decision fatigue galore, trying to figure out how to best use that instrument. Now, the thing that's really, I think, continues to impress a lot of people about the instrument or surprise them is that your feet play the organ as well. And I'm working on showing you that. There are these pedals down here, and as I play, they make noise just as the keyboards do. And I'm not wearing them at the moment, but there's special footwear for the organ. Yes, parents, you may think you've probably had to buy your kids footwear for dance class, for hockey, for baseball, for you name it. Who'd have thought that the organist also has footwear? These shoes are custom ordered for the organ, and one of the reasons, there's this thin leather sole here that's specifically designed. This is all there is to the bottom of the shoe, so the organist can feel those pedals, feel where they are. There's also this thick platform heel that helps the organist to depress the heel by twisting the ankle in order to play notes. That's one of the things that makes this instrument incredibly versatile. Now, I'm going to reverse the shot here and show you a couple mechanisms that I find to be very fascinating on this device. I'm having a bit of difficulty reversing the shot, so bear with me as I turn the camera around. If you look up in the high corner there are shades, and I'm about to move them by means of a pedal that's housed in the center of the organ console. Now what those do is they affect the sound, they affect the volume. There are pipes housed in there, and for example, as I play a bit and close them, it gets softer. On the contrary, as I open them, not surprisingly, they get louder. So, that's a mechanism that allows the organist to control volume. Another mechanism that I had mentioned computers, is you look at this organ console, that's what we call this kind of control deck, if you will. The organ itself is housed behind that wooden facade, but this is the control deck, basically. And you notice many knobs here, each of them bearing different names. They control individual ranks of pipes, that is, specific sounds. And each of them has a different character, and that allows you to achieve kind of a variety of tone colors. Now, absent having to pull all of these vigorously while you're playing, luckily there is a preset system so that, for example, you see number 1 here, you push number 1, and a specific set of knobs pop out. Any of these will do that. So that enables the organist to preset a series of combinations and engage them without having to push multiple buttons. It's an efficiency mechanism, and it also allows the organist to maximally utilize the colors of it without having to negotiate playing, because very often these changes are being made midstream while playing. And hopefully subtle. My hope is they aren't very noticeable during Mass or during a recital or whenever. You want them to be subtle. So, having shown you a few mechanisms, I'll give you a little tonal tour of it. Show you a few imitative facets of the organ. To do that, so the organ is its own instrument. Of course, there are certain sounds. For example, if you hear, yeah, it's your classic scary movie organ sound. That said, there are also imitative sounds. The flute. Right? There's also a clarinet. Or an oboe. Or a trumpet, a couple of trumpets. In addition to that, there are stops that imitate the strings, right? And they can very possibly be made to sound almost like a full-string orchestra playing. Or, if you will, a French horn. So in addition to being an organ, sounding stereotypically like an organ, it can be imitative of all various and sundry instruments. All right, let me take you now back to the room where it all happens, the blower room. Take you back to the lungs of the organ. And pardon me as we walk. You're now with me in the blower room, and I'm talking a bit louder. The blower room, sadly, kind of doubles as a storage room in my case, so bear with me as I try not to trip over things. This is the engine that produces all of the wind. It's a large contained fan, oiled so as to avoid overheating, and then it pumps air into this reservoir, which ensures that there's a steady supply of wind. Again, for an organ to sound maximally stable, for it to sound in tune, for it to make the sound it's intended to, the wind needs to not only be powerful enough, but consistent. Otherwise, fluctuations in volume, and pitch, and various other parameters will make the sound somewhat unhealthy, will make it almost disconcerting. But now, I'm going to temporarily pause you, take my own life into my hands, and climb this lovely, narrow little ladder up into the swell chamber of the organ. Pray for the eternal repose of my soul, should anything happen. Alrighty, folks, here we are, up in the chambers. This is where it all happens. So, first off, totally beside the point, but you get a kind of neat aerial view of the church. We're really almost right up to the ceiling here, looking down through the grill. This is where a lot of the sound happens. This is what's called the swell division of the organ, called the swell because of these shades that you see. Again, that when they close can cage all of the sound back here and cause it to sound softer, thereby allowing dynamic control. So you see here pipes made of wood with these stoppers. You see pipes made of various metals and alloys, and each of them has a different anatomy or construction oriented at achieving a different sound. There are all told about over 2,000, I'd say about 2,200 pipes or so in this organ. Some of them as small as just this little guy that's not even the size of my index finger, ranging to ones that are 16 feet tall, which I'll show you in just a moment as we go into another division of the organ. We're now in another corner of the organ known as the bottom of the Great Division. Here you're seeing pipes of noticeably different size. You'll also see that even though we're kind of barricaded right now, we're in a location where these pipes are not masked by shades. That is to say, there's no mechanism of volume control, as perhaps you saw on previous divisions when we were up in the swell. I'm climbing a ladder here, and I'm bringing us onto a walkboard that is behind some of the largest pipes on the organ. If we look at that one in the corner, it's 16 feet tall and wide open. It's one of the most resonant pipes, and there are also a few longer ones yet to produce an even lower pitch than those can make. The larger the pipe, the lower the pitch. And here you see what's known as the Great Division. Known as Great because it's, historically speaking, the largest or the boldest on the organ. And in this case, as in with most, it's unenclosed, completely unencumbered by any shades as you see over there. Also another great aerial view of the church from here. And back down the ladder we go. Thank you once again for bearing with me on this tour of the church, of the organ, and again, kind of on an explanation of the rationale for the church having beautiful things, which again are not just pretty things to look at, but things that outwardly display an inward and underlying goodness of some mystery of the faith. It is my hope that this has been edifying, and I also hope that if you're a parishioner here or somebody who happens to ever visit here, please come up and see the Loft in person. I'd be happy to give you a nickel tour in person, kind of show you the ropes here. It's been a delight being with you. I leave you now with a very famed piece of organ music by French composer Charles-Marie Widor.